Hi, Ray Poynter here, and I'll be joined shortly by Geoff Lowe from Infotools. So here is the agenda. We're talking about how to search for the story in survey data. So I'm just going to start off with a quick reminder about the NewMR framework, and you can see more about this in other webinars we've done. Then I'm going to talk about the example data we're going to be using today because it's all built around a case study. And then we're going to go through the processes laid out in that framework. Then I'm going to hand over to Geoff, and he's going to show how we find relevant exceptions, and he's going to show that using Harmony, and he's going to give us some tips about how we can do that. And then we're going to take Q&A. So first of all, a quick reminder about the NewMR framework. It's got these 8 steps. So we define the problem, we link it to a wider context, we organize the data, we take the business question as a lens so that we look in the right places. We find the main story first, the big picture. Then we find the relevant exceptions. Then we create an overall story, which we communicate using the think, feel, do mechanism. Defining the problem. We all know about the pandemic crisis. This was focused on market researchers and insight professionals. What we wanted to know was, 1, are researchers coping with the pandemic crisis? If not, what are the problems and who is experiencing them? And 3, what should the leaders of the research industry be doing if there are problems and if we can identify what those problems are and who is experiencing them? There's obviously an enormously wide context going on. Working from home has become the norm. Lots of client companies in hibernation. There was this widespread belief that people would have lots of spare time, but some people question that, so we wanted to explore that in the first wave of this study. Lots of concern about the plight of freelancers and sole traders. So we wanted to make sure that the design of the project was going to take this on board and that we access that sort of information. The case study we're showing you is from the second wave of this study. As part of that background of information, we reviewed the messages from the first wave. And in the first wave, we found that most people are coping with the pandemic crisis, but about 1 in 6 are not. Most people are working from home, which is okay for most people, but not for about 20% of us. And the key things that our research leaders, the leaders of our organizations and our companies and our associations should be doing: advocate for research, help support the well-being of our people. The research I'm going to talk about was a survey conducted with insight and research professionals around the world. The first wave had about just over 1,000 people responding. The second wave had just over 1,000 people. And we're focusing on the second wave. So we're going to add a research question. Has anything changed between the end of March and early April, which is when the first wave took place, and the end of April, early May, which is when the second wave took place? And if there are any changes, what are the implications for what the research leaders and organizations should be doing? The next step is we have to organize the data, and this starts during fieldwork. We're looking to see, are there any problems? What are the emerging messages? Do we need to tweak the research? We may find that one question isn't working terribly well. We need to add another break, or we need to add a clarification. We want to check the data. Does it look right? And we've got to create a data set that can be investigated. This study, like the first wave, was conducted using the QuestionPro platform. Big shout out and thank you to them for lending us the platform. And we get these sorts of statistics as it's running. We see that we've got an almost 80% completion rate. Experience tells me that's pretty good. We've got 1,113 completes before we start having a look at whether some of those are bogus. We get some geographic information, first of all in the picture, more meaningfully in the numbers on the right hand side. So just over 15% of the sample at that point was coming from the US. Every study I've run pretty much for the last 30 years has had as the last question, is there anything else you'd like to tell us about this topic or this survey? And if there are problems with the study, we see that mentioned here. We see all sorts of comments. So when I look at this, I will look at the fieldwork 2 or 3 times a day. The first thing I look at is the last question. Nope, stay safe. No, really interesting topic. Nope. So we're looking through those, checking for if there are any signs of problems with the survey instrument. We're also looking at the other open ends. So this is one of the questions that we asked since the COVID-19 pandemic started. Are you working fewer hours, similar hours, more hours, don't know, other? Only 25 people clicked other, so that means we've got a reasonable coverage with the closed options, but we're going to have a look at the open ends. If you do an international study, there are a lot of people who are very happy to answer questions in English, but who will not type open ends in English. So using my good friend Google, we had a look, and the first open end there was Portuguese was not working. Another one without research work. And so we're looking down there, and there is no systematic pattern that says we've got a problem with the question or the data. We want to know where people are from, and so we want an easy option for people who are just actually having a look at the survey and are not doing a real good job. And so we've added in Abyssinia because alphabetically it comes first. It's the discontinued name. It's a country that used to be around, and now we know that the person, or we're relatively confident that the person who picked Albania is actually from Albania, not the first name on the list. So that's 3 people there that we are going to almost certainly remove from the data, and when I looked at the rest of the information, yes, they were removed from the data. What are the emerging messages? So just while the field work's going on, because I'm checking those open ends, I see there's lots of mentions about the sole traders, the freelancers, the one-man companies, the zero contract hour people. There are some really, really sad cases. There were some people who were commenting that they didn't know how they were going to eat or feed their families. About half the people reported a drop in income, and the data looked pretty similar to the first wave, which was slightly surprising in some cases, but reassuring. So then once the data is collected, we start to have a close look at it. This study was conducted using the strict anonymity, so things like the IP address and so on were not passed back to us. Length of time taken in seconds, obviously we're going to look at anybody who's particularly quick. That top person there, 27 seconds, they're almost certainly not going to be a good interview as part of this checking process. Another part of the checking process, in the open ends, some salespeople had put links to their investments and their companies. So we can pretty much see that those are not serious insight professionals sharing their views. We didn't force anybody to answer all of the questions. Most of the questions were optional. So one of the things that we will do is say, what are we going to call a complete? So we're going to have a look. If they answered one of the last 3 questions, then they're going to be a complete. If they didn't answer any of the last 3 questions, they're not a complete. And that top line there is that person who got through the survey in 27 seconds. Are we going to use them? No, we're not going to use them. I've cleaned the data, but it's not a job that I normally delegate because I find out a lot of useful information about my data when I'm doing that cleaning, organizing process. So now I've got to create a data set we can interrogate. So I exported it to SPSS. When you're moving your survey between packages, perhaps you're using Q, perhaps you're using Harmony, perhaps you're using SPSS, try to avoid going into CSV or Excel. You lose too much information. You then have to type it back in frequently. The countries, we had lots of countries with 4, 5, 6, 20, 25 responses. We don't want to report those because it's compromising from a quality point of view, and it's compromising potentially from an anonymity point of view. So we group the countries into sub-regions and regions. We also need to read what people have typed into the other, because some people have typed into the other a country that actually was in the study. So we're going to recode those back. Then we need to integrate them with the previous wave, and of course you're going to add a wave variable. And then we're going to sense check it that we don't have anything that's really strange. So maybe we've got something that's the opposite way round in one data set to the other. So all of that needs checking. Once we've got that, we're ready to start looking. And how do we look? We use the business question as a lens. We're not trying to find everything that's interesting in the data. We're seeking to answer the business questions and to provide insights into decisions. So Here are our 3 business questions again. Are researchers coping with the pandemic crisis? If not, what are the problems and who's experiencing them? What should the leaders of the research industry be doing? And we had that additional research question, has anything changed between wave 1 and wave 2? And if so, what are the implications? Now, we don't want to be like a trawler. A trawler throws the net out and scrapes and has a look at everything that's dragged up off the bottom, and frequently has to throw lots of things back into the sea because they're not actually what they're looking for. We want to be like a detective. We want to use our questions to look for clues. We want to build those clues together. This study wasn't terribly large. Most data sets these days are getting bigger and bigger. There is no time available to look at every possible option, and it's really inefficient, and most of what you find that way will be irrelevant. You need to learn to seek the useful things, and you do that by using the business question as your lens. And first of all, before you start looking for exceptions and differences, look for the main story. Now, because we are doing 2 things here, we're comparing wave 1 with wave 2, and we've also got the total column. So mostly I'm going to be looking at the total column because the total column is what tells me where the main story is. But I'm also going to pay a little bit of attention to the wave 1, wave 2 difference. So in the first table, I looked at all my variables, wave 1, wave 2, and total. And what we see is that about 1 in 6 pick a sad face. Now, I've been analysing data professionally for over 40 years. Before that, I was doing computer science and data analytics at university, and I have always annotated. I see people with 2 years experience thinking they can remember everything. No, annotate as you go through so you can find that information. On the next table down in there, we see that about 5% of people are working in an office, which is similar to wave 1. I make a note of that. About 90% of people are working from home. That is similar to wave 1, so we make a note of that. Really important note here, it's not a lot of people, but it's a really important feature. About 10% of the sample were not working, so they were at home, but they're not working from home. Now, these percentages are similar to wave 10, and we need to pay attention to that when we are looking at the base for different questions. About 3% picked other. Now we have this question. At the moment, does working from home suit you? This was asked to people who were at home at the moment and working from home as an option. And of those, 80% said it suits them, which is very similar to last time. So the big story is that it suits 80%. An important feature of that is that it doesn't suit 20%, and these are the people who are working from home. We annotate it. I've not talked about statistical significance. There's a really good reason for that. The sample, 2,000 people, 1,000 in the first wave, 1,000 in the second wave. There are lots of differences that are statistically significant, but I want substantial differences. I don't just want statistical significance. I want things that are interesting. Most things which are statistically significant but small are not interesting. They are not part of the story. So in this sort of study, I'm looking for differences of about 10 percentage points or more. This is a story finding exercise. It's not about measuring the minutiae. So when you look at your data, think about how big a difference do you really want to be looking at. Don't just look at the statistically significant differences. Aim a bit higher. Aim for things that are really going to give you a story. A couple more of those examples. Here is we've got a question. Since the pandemic, are you working fewer hours, similar hours, more hours? And what we see is quite an interesting pattern in that it's about 1/3. When we're looking at data, don't look at those decimal places. Don't really look at the numbers in the units column. Look at the tens column. And here we see that it's about 31, about 34, about 30. Yeah, it's a third, a third, a third. That is the story in that data. When we go down, it's a very similar thing. We don't say, 47.8 without round to 48, the other one rounds to 47%. Now, about half have got a lower income. And if you just say that without any other piece of information, about half the people who answered us have got a lower income now than they had in February. That is a major important factor. And almost nobody is earning more. We're going to process the open ends. Now, in this study, there are about 750 suggestions that were more than a letter or a word long, and I read all 750. If there had been 7,500, I would either have used sampling or I would have used a combination of text analytics and human. But for this number, I'm going to read them. And I'm going to Google Translate the ones that are not in English. And I'm going to annotate as I go through the sorts of things they are. Now, I might later on code those, or I might just let the picture build up. Now, one of the things that I would always say is when you're reading on those open ends, focus on things the leaders could be doing to tackle current problems. We're not going to report every topic mentioned. Some people just talked about we should not show significance, or we should do sampling in this particular way because this is a really important topic to them. It didn't answer the question. It's not part of the story that we are going to be talking about in terms of what should our leaders be doing to tackle the problems faced by people in our industry caused by the pandemic crisis. We want to look for the main stories. What are the things that lots of people are saying? And we want to aggregate the information to find the main story. Don't be swayed by hard cases. As I said, there were some terribly hard cases, but they were 4 or 5 or 6. So they are not the main story. They're going to stay with you as stories. And you need to be careful of articulate responses. Don't give extra weight to articulate responses. And generalize the specific to facilitate finding the main story. So I'm going to show you an example of exactly what I mean from one of the open ends. Keep up the pressure on MPs and the Treasury to help one-man bans. So this is almost certainly from the UK because the term MPs and the Treasury is a combination we see in the UK. So I'm going to generalise that. Advocate with governments and similar bodies. I'm going to aggregate up to help market research people in need. They were talking about one-man bans, but actually I think they mean anybody in need. But then I'm going to take that point specifically sole traders, freelancers, one-man bans. So one-man bans is a term that's used, but freelancers, gig employees, zero contract people, sole traders, all of those need to be collectively brought together. So I've generalized this statement into things that are easier for me then to code into the main story. Once we've got the main story, we're going to look for relevant exceptions. And when we do that, what we tend to do is make the things we've found that are important the dependent variable. What do I mean by the dependent variable? Well, in SPSS and in tabs packages, it means in most countries setting those as the columns and all the other variables as the rows. Now, Geoff is going to show you an alternative and I think a somewhat better way of doing that. But it means setting as the dependent variable the thing you're interested in, and then we're looking for big differences around 10% or more. So I'm just going to show you briefly how I started that process looking at it in SPSS before handing over to Geoff. We know that sad, neutral, happy is really important. So we set that as the columns and start to look through for the patterns. 90% of people who picked a happy face said working from home suits them. This drops to 68% of people who picked a sad face said working from home suits them. So now I'm going to make my annotation that working from home has got an interesting interaction. I'm going to want to explore that. I'm going to want to look at the data in 2 or 3 different ways to get to the bottom of it. Similarly, we see an interaction with changing hours worked and the face chosen. 41% of the happy face people said they're working similar hours, but only 28% of the sad face people said they're working similar hours. I make a note of it, it's something I need to explore. And there's an interaction between face and income. 41% of the happy faces say their income is lower, but 64% of sad faces say their income is lower. So I'm highlighting all the people who've got a different story and the people that I'm going to want to go and explore more. But with that in mind, I'm going to hand over now to Geoff, who's going to show you first of all an example of taking as a relevant exception New Zealand, and then he's going to show you who's better off and who's worse off. So over to you, Geoff.
Thanks a lot, Ray. So here we are in Harmony, and as Ray promised, I'm going to take us through two examples, exception examples. One based on New Zealand and the other based on what is it that makes us as research professionals better off or worse off now compared to pre-pandemic. So this first analysis I'm going to do is looking at region and wave, and I really want to have a look at the key variable in this study, which is the happiness. So I'm going to set a filter of happiness and set the percentages so that they tell us what percentage of insights professionals in each country for each wave are reporting those top two happiness boxes. I'm going to turn significant differences on first of all so we can see if any of the differences are significant, and indeed there are two. Our colleagues in India are reporting lower levels of happiness between wave 1 and 2, and our friends in the UK higher levels, and they both look like they are differences of substance, to Ray's point. Let me just check that by adding the differences in here. And we can see that absolutely yes, 16 percentage points down in India, 12 percentage points up in the UK. These are differences of significance. What I really want to see here though is what's going on here in New Zealand. And to do that, I'm going to rank the table by wave 2, and we see that we here, the researchers in New Zealand, are reporting the highest levels of happiness across all of these regions. And the real question is, what is it that differentiates us from everybody else? Now, to answer that question, I can do that quite easily, simply by asking the Harmony to discover everything there is about our selected group here in New Zealand from Ray's NewMR survey here. So if I click on that, it does a discover run. Now I no longer need to have a happy filter, and I need my percentages to be based on the region, since that's at the top of the table. I also know that some of these questions were asked only of wave 1 and some only of wave 2. So I need to make sure that my percentages are based on just those respondents who qualify for each question or each variable, in which case I'll choose total qualified. Now all my percentages are correct and appropriate. So what the Discover table tells us about us here in New Zealand is that we are more likely to be working from home, that we are working similar hours compared to before, and that our income is about the same as it was before. Now, two of those, the income and the hours worked, are differences of substance, according to Ray's rule of thumb. And so those are the two that I really want to look into. The fact that everything else seems to be going downhill, but for us here in New Zealand, for more of us than everywhere else, things are about the same, and that feels good. It makes us happy. Now, if we want to really see New Zealand in the context of the rest of the world, we should compare New Zealand with the rest of the world. And we can do that in Discover simply by adding all of the other regions and countries to the analysis. I'll just add that in there. And we'll expand our screen again. There we go. So what we now see is that same list of items that positively differentiate researchers in New Zealand from everybody else. But we also see which other countries and regions are the most similar to those of us here in New Zealand. And you can see that Canada is the most similar, then the USA, then the UK, and so on. So they have similar characteristics to us here in New Zealand. Over on the right-hand side of the table are those regions or countries that are least similar, including our friends in India, which we saw had taken a dip in happiness between the two waves. So let's make them the target and have a look at what differentiates them. So in India, and I'm going to add the differences back in here again, these are all really big differences, as well as being statistically significant. And this statistical significance is based on Bayesian statistics. What really differentiates them is that they are in big companies, that they are working more hours, and also that they were, back in wave 1, optimistic about how the length of the disruption due to the pandemic. I'm going to have a look at one more country, and that's Australia. So it stands to reason, or you would think, that given that they are just across the Tasman from us here in New Zealand, and New Zealand and Australia were seen to have handled the pandemic in similarly effective ways, that things would be about the same. But look at this. The thing that most differentiates our colleagues in Australia from everyone else is that they are worse off. Now, and I should also add that their income is lower than it was pre-pandemic. So this is a nice segue into the second part of my story, and that is, what is it that makes researchers believe that they are materially worse off or better off since pre-pandemic? And to do that, let's have a look at more of Ray's survey. So in wave 2, there was two questions asked about working fewer hours and income, or fewer or more hours and income lower or higher compared to before the pandemic. I want to drill into that. First of all, though, I want to find out what is it that's driving happiness. And to do that, I'm going to use Discover again. I'll drag the happiness variable into the Discover. And this tells us that this is profiling happy now, those of us who are happy, that working from home suits. There's a lot of people working from home, and there is a slightly higher percentage who say that it suits. That things have not changed an awful lot since the pandemic started in terms of income, and the same for working hours. So the same for us here in New Zealand. The things have not changed. That tends to make us feel a little bit happier. On the other hand, what is differentiating our sad colleagues from everybody else is that income is lower. Working from home does not suit, or in fact might not be working at all. And again, here is that worse off that we saw for Australia. So it seems that there's a really strong relationship between working hours, income, and whether or not a researcher is happy. So it got us to thinking. Let's have a look at the relationship between working hours and income separately by region, and then we'll have a look at a combination of the two. To do that, we'll start with hours. I want to see how this varies by region, so I'll cross that by region. Now, we'll graph it. I think it's easier to see this in a graph as a stacked bar chart. Now, because I've only chosen some of the elements here, we need the percentages to be based on just these three elements here, and I can do that by changing my percentage to just those respondents who are included in the analysis. And here we are, and I'm also going to rank this by one of the elements, in this case working fewer hours, so that it's easier to see the pattern. And in this case, the pattern is that there is quite a difference between those countries and regions on the left and those on the right in terms of whether or not people are working more or fewer hours. In India, we know are relatively unhappy, are working more hours, significantly so, and fewer of them are working fewer hours. But New Zealand is also in that right-hand side. And in fact, New Zealand, Canada, two relatively happy countries, are mixed up with Australia and India, two relatively unhappy countries. So we're looking at an influencer of happiness, but probably not the main driver. Let's have a look now at income. And we can do that simply by replacing hours with income. Once again, we will rank the table by one of the elements, in this case lower, so we can see the pattern. And now we've got what looks to be a much stronger relationship between the variable income and the countries we know to be on the happy side of the scale. New Zealand is right there, Canada, significantly more likely to be about the same in terms of the income before pre-pandemic. And on the other side, we've got Australia right down here, on much more likely to have a lower income. One of the things we noticed here is that there also seemed to be a real mismatch. So in India, for example, we saw that there are 50%, half of our colleagues in India are on a lower income, but very few of them are doing less hours, and a lot of them, in fact, are doing more hours. And that made us think that there are people in India who are materially worse off. In other words, they're working more and getting paid less. we thought it would be an idea to create a variable that quantified that, and we've done it. We've called it status, and we've defined those who are better off as those who are working less or the same and getting paid more. Those that are worse off are those who are working more and getting paid less. I won't go into the detailed definitions, but it's simply an interaction between the number of hours worked and the income. So if I take this variable and replace my income one, and for this one, I don't want to graph the whole thing. What I want to do is just look at the average line. What we did was assign an average of, I'm going to make this 0 decimal places. We made the better off 100 a value of 100, worse off a value of minus 100, and this average line tells us exactly who is what the average better off, worse off value is for each country or region. I'm going to rank it so that the least worse off comes to the left, and if I graph that now as a bar chart, you can see we've got quite a range from North and West Europe, who are the least worse off, across to Australia and India, who are the most worse off, using that formula of the interaction between income and hours worked. Now, the big story in this chart is that everybody, even those who are least impacted in North and West Europe, everybody is on the negative side of the scale, so less than 0. But there is also a really big difference between those who are least impacted and those who are most impacted. There's a lot of things that we could drill down on here, but I'm going to leave it at that and hand back to Ray. Thank you.
Thanks, Geoff. That was really useful. So we're almost wrapping up. So we're getting to the point where we're going to communicate the findings. And as you will know, if you see my webinars on this, I believe in the think, feel, do method of communicating that. The think is all about the data. That's the processing we do. From the think, we work out what is the do that we want the audience, the client, the stakeholder to do. And in this case, the do is that some people need help. We want the leaders in our organization to find out who needs help. We want colleagues to try to find out who needs help and to try and help them. We want the leaders of our industry to be advocating for the importance of market research. And then there are lots of secondary do's, such as going digital, being resilient, and thinking about the long term. The feel is the way we communicate the do. So we might take one of those really hard cases that I talked about earlier and use those as an example to make the feeling really effective. But our recommendation is actually based on the data that generated the do, and the feel is how we communicate it. So what was the story? Well, when I first shared this data with some people, quite a few of them said, well, the story is 80% of people are coping fine. But if that was the story, what is the implied action? The implied action is, actually, this is not a big problem, it's no action. The do we want to create is find who has a problem and see if you can help it. Because it's only 20%, it is possible to tackle it. If 80% of our industry had a problem, it would probably not be soluble. When it's 20%, the story is we can handle this, we can do something about it. So the story has to be most are okay, but some aren't. There's lots and lots more data in the report, so please go to the NewMR website and download a copy. And with that, I'm going to hand the microphone back to Sue, and we look forward to hearing your questions.
Thank you, Ray, and thank you, Geoff. Ray, I think this might be one for you, but Geoff, feel free to chip in with an answer if you'd like to. Is 10% a good rule of thumb for differences instead of just relying upon statistical significance, or just relevant for this study? If there is a 10% or more difference, but not related to the business questions, do you exclude that from the report?
So I'll take the last point first. If there is a really big difference and it's not related to the business question, then it will nearly always be excluded, unless it brings up something which I think the client needs to hear. So sometimes you discover something which is really important and wasn't part of the business question, because there's always a kind of implied other business question. Is there anything else that I should know that I need to tackle? Is kind of an implied business question that's there. So if it generated a really big finding and it was something that they needed to tackle, then it would make it in, but otherwise it wouldn't. 10%, no, that number goes up and down depending on the context. So if I'm doing a very detailed study about product options and formulations and people can tweak them, I might look at a 5 or a 7% difference. If I'm looking at a market entry structural strategic sort of picture, I might well be looking for 20%. So I have a sense for different situations and I look at the data to be guided, but 10% is a really good starting point. It's also quite often we're looking at cells of 100 and 10% is the plus or minus margin of error. So you also know that you've got this nice big number within that as well. But I want differences where I can see what is going on. And I'll come back to one method of getting those differences as we go through the questions.
Thanks, Ray. Geoff, did you want to pop in an answer there, or you think it's been covered?
Yeah, look, I will add one small point. I agree with everything Ray has said. There are some situations, for example, if the group that you care about is a particularly small group, and so in other words, the incidence is low. For example, brand awareness or brand preference for a new or emerging brand, then the differences that you're going to be looking at that you will find not just significant, but also of substance, to Ray's point, will be smaller. So I think the overall rule of thumb of 10% percentage points, I think, is a very good one. But I think give yourself flexibility when the groups that you care about, your brand, smaller brand, are relatively small.
So really the key takeaway is actually not the exact percentage, but to have a strategy and a study-specific number in mind when you're going through the study. Ray, you shared quite some practical tips on data cleaning and including one of them that it's not a job you like to delegate. Obviously, it varies a bit in terms of study size, complexity, things like that. How much time would you typically put aside to clean data?
That's a really good question. I would guess, for example, on this study, which is not a big study, I probably spent 2 hours on cleaning and structuring. Now, part of structuring was deciding which regions I was going to combine together, having a look at the open ends to see what needed to go elsewhere. And that was in the light of the fact that I'd been monitoring the open ends and the feedback during the data collection process. So certainly for this one, and I'm a relatively fast worker because I've been doing it for such a long time, that I would say for this, it would be a couple of hours. If you're talking about a really big project from multiple countries, it can actually take days, because if you find something that you can't understand why there is a problem, so the data for France is completely different to the data for Germany, Italy, and the UK, well, you're going to have to get translations of all the survey questions to see if the question was asked in the same way, go back to the data collection company, and you might find that that takes 8 or 10 hours to pursue one question through those routes. And in those situations, it's nice to have somebody helping you chase all that through. But nevertheless, I always want to be involved in that process.
Thanks, Ray. Sometimes there are situations where the verbatims are so generic that they do not give you anything. And it is those hard cases which give you the action areas that we are looking for. In such cases, should we still continue to keep aside those hard cases, or should we take them up and use them directionally?
I tend to avoid this use of the word directionally. I see it when we have with quantitative data and all the numbers move in the same direction, but they're not significant. People say, well, we can treat them as directional. No, that is just saying that it's sample wobble. If you think there is something interesting, then you need to triangulate and you need to pull information from other sources. So you look at those and you say, well, this seems to be saying that this has become more important. Can I find support for that in published studies, other studies, by asking questions or by reorganizing the data? So if I see some hard cases, then I will certainly look around to see, well, can I support that with other information elsewhere? I will certainly use them in the communication of the findings. But if there are 3 really, really difficult hard cases in the data, it might mean there are only 3 in the 2000. So I have to bear that in mind. I have to be able to support it in some other way, rather than just saying directional. So my recommendation to the industry and everybody listening is to drop the word directional from your lexicon. Start finding ways to substantiate your view other than leaning on that particular crutch.
Great. What about the other part of that question where coming across verbatims that are considered generic? Would that be something that you talk about monitoring the study, fairly constantly while it's in field? Would that be something you'd attempt to tweak partway through the field work, just to perhaps change the wording to drive a verbatim a bit more, or an open-ended question a bit more for what you were looking for?
Absolutely. So we try to ask verbatims which we think will generate things. And if we are thinking of using text analytics, you also want to make sure that you are producing questions that are going to give you long enough amounts of text that you can really get to grips with it. So if I'm looking at a study and they're all a little bit generic, I might tweak the question, or I might add another question and say, and what leads you to say that? Might be an additional question. Because let's say we're collecting 2,000 interviews. After 500 interviews, I'm looking at it, it's quite generic. I am pretty comfortable about adding in a couple of open-ended questions, particularly towards the end of the survey, because I'm not doing counting analysis when I'm looking at the responses to the open end. So absolutely tweak the questions, add an open-ended question, try to think about ways of making it a little bit more provocative, so you are going to get something a bit more to work with.
Great. And here's a question about online questionnaire length. Talking about online questionnaire length, do you use any threshold below which you would consider that a respondent is a speedy one? For instance, if the median length is 400 seconds, would you consider a respondent invalid if she had spent below 320, so minus 20% seconds?
So what I tend to do, there are some times which are so fast that I'm almost sure then are going to not be great interviews. So I'll have a quick confirmation of that and then out they go. And I will certainly look at the median length. And that's a great question, because please, everybody, never look at the average length, look at median length. How long was the middle interview? Because it tends to be a very skewed distribution. But I won't use a rule of thumb on timing. I will have a group that I think are of interest. And when I see that most interviews of this length have got good data, and what do I mean by good data? So if most interviews of this length have good data, then that speed is not too fast. What do I mean by good data? The open ends make sense. The pattern of numbers makes sense. So they're happy with this and they're not happy with that. And so what they're going to choose is the first one, not the second one. If we've got a logical flow through that, then that's fine. That tells me that there's a really good chance that this interview is a genuine interview. And when I get to the length of time where genuine interviews are common, then I stop using time as one of the key criteria. I've got other things I'm looking for in that process. But just ranking your data. So you take the data as part of the cleaning process, rank it by length of survey, start from the shortest ones, put in the annotations, and you'll soon get a good idea of what's going on and how quickly can some people answer the survey sensibly.
Thanks, Ray. One of the tips you gave, and I'm going to refer to you, but I think this is actually more a question for Geoff. Your tip about exporting the data, say in an SPSS style format, so that you're bringing out, like the question labels and similar things. So you're bringing all that information in just to save a lot of, setup time, which is a good tip. Geoff, we sort of move seamlessly into you showing the data in Harmony. How much time would you set aside to, take a raw data file and put it into Harmony? And how does that vary by, different file formats, etc.?
Yeah, that is really how long is a piece of string question. In this particular case, Ray had done such a great job of curating the data. It was in really good shape. And I think from beginning to end, like Ray with his data curation and sorting out the source data, I did this work on my own in Harmony. I would have spent no more than half an hour turning the data that Ray sent in SPSS into that Harmony project that you saw with that tree view. I think the points that Ray made about using SPSS rather than other flat files is a really good one, because of the information that is retained when you use SPSS and necessarily lost if you export to other formats. And I think that really helped. So I would endorse Ray's comments about SPSS in that regard for sure.
Okay, audience, we are running out of questions. I'm going to ask one more. So if you've been sitting there perhaps thinking about asking a question but not doing so, if you'd like to take the last opportunity, please type it in now while we answer this other question. Other than that, you'll miss your chance. Ray and Geoff, chip in too if this suits you. Strikes me that a lot of the tips and advice that you've both given in this presentation are really terrific things for people to think about, but they're really practical sort of tips. They're not ones that you would, find in a standard market research textbook. They're probably the sort of things that you'd learn while you're working, from a more experienced colleague or similar. Ray, if somebody is looking to get some more experience in this area, what are some options they could do to sort of learn these things?
Well, there are courses that most of the societies, so the Research Society in Australia, the MRS, all run courses, so those are possible. And now these things are moving online. That's a good option there. I would certainly say have a look at David Smith's book, and we'll put a quote at that, something like the science and the art of finding the message in the data. So I'm just looking around behind me to see if I can see it on my shelf. I know it is on my shelf. The Art and Science of Interpreting Market Research Evidence by David Smith. It's got a lot of stuff along that line. And the University of Georgia's MRII courses have got some great stuff on data analysis. Declaration of Interest, I wrote it, but it talks about creating an analysis plan. And I think that if you're learning the data analysis process, getting in the habit of writing a plan of how you're going to be doing it is a good thing that stops you tearing off in all sorts of directions and stops you doing too much in the wrong space, really.
Okay, thanks, Ray. So we have answered all of the questions that have come along. So probably nothing else to do but really finish off. Once again, Big thanks to the NewMR sponsors who are on the screen at the moment.